back, everybody. We're deep in the agenda for our first day of TFI. This is our, what I would say, our annual broadband panel. We've also done a wireless panel in the past, two separate panels. I think Larry was pretty quick to realize that due to convergence, two of the three people on the wireline panel, we're going to be on the wireless panel. So let's combine this. So we're now doing a combined session, telecom in general. Originally, this was supposed to be moderated by Jeff Binkley of Ryan. Jeff had some matters come up. He wasn't unable to attend. Jeff, if you're listening, we're all thinking about you and hope everything is going well. So for my part, I wanted to step in and just discuss and introduce, first of all, for the attendees on the panel. We've got Brandt Palmer with T-Mobile, Gary Hunter with AT&T, and John Reed with Charter. They've each got sections of their slides that they're going to walk through. Really, that's my role, is just to introduce them and to let them take it away. So, Brandt, it's all you.
Okay, everybody hear me? I'm just gonna have a seat. I'm not gonna walk around. I've got a few slides here on the state of the industry for wireless. I get this clicker to work. This slide here is from Goldman Sachs and shows the wireless CapEx trends over the last, over a 20-year period, back to 2007 and up through estimated through 2027. The vertical blocks, I guess you could say, are in billions of dollars. And the green line represents CapEx intensity, which is capital expenditures as a percentage of revenues. You'll notice there in 2022, capital expenditures reached their peak. And down in 2024, we've come down quite a bit, and it's estimated to remain about those levels going forward. Interestingly, most of the carriers have decreased their capital expenditures for the last couple of years. If you can't see the numbers there, Verizon's down from $15.2 billion to 11.4. AT&T's actually up $1 billion from 9.7 to 10.7. T-Mobile was at $14 billion. I think it's actually closer to $15 billion in 2022. So these numbers might be a little bit low. I don't know if they represent cash CapEx only or what the difference is, but regardless, $14 billion down to 8.9, and Dish from 2.6 down to 1. So as an industry, in 2022, it was $41.5 billion in CapEx. 2024, part of which is estimated on here, I think this came out prior to year end, was at $32 billion. And as you can see from the CapEx intensity, so the percentage of revenues, it went from around 21% in 2022 down to 14% in 2024. So I threw this slide in here. I think probably most of us are pretty familiar with the spectrum layout among the carriers. But Ian was just talking about spectrum and how it's probably not going to change anytime soon, or at least materially. You can see here AT&T and Verizon are pretty close in average megahertz pops per market, 279 and 265, and T-Mobile still leading the pack at 382. So for all intents and purposes, it'll probably remain pretty much the same for at least the next several years, given all the constraints that Ian just identified with the DoD and FCC. This next slide here is the share of wireless market over the last 12 years. You can see there at the beginning of 2012, Verizon had a commanding lead, just under 41% of the market. AT&T close second at 34%. And then a distant third and fourth, Sprint and T-Mobile. That's obviously changed, coming up to 2024, Q1 at least. Verizon's down to 36, T-Mobile's at 30, and AT&T's at 27.9%. Verizon having dropped almost 5%, T-Mobile increasing 19.2%, but most of that obviously is the Sprint acquisition. If you take the 30% minus the 14.3 from 2012 for Sprint and the 10.8, you get an increase of just about 5% for T-Mobile, and AT&T dropping about 6.2%. You'll notice the green line on the bottom, that's the increase in wireless from the cable companies, though. So Ruben just mentioned, and Larry talked about a little bit earlier, convergence, and so wireless. We'll have a slide here in a minute about that as well, but wireline entering into the wireless market. So they're at 6% of the market, at least as of Q1 2024.
Yep. At what point is T-Mobile expected to take over, become number one?
Steve?
This is the
before or after
the
you're
classic
gone.
Steve setup that I was throw it.
Full faith and confidence that our momentum will continue from challenger, right, to
Champion. Thanks, Ruben. This slide here is talking about postpaid churn, or in other words, the percentage of the customer base that turns over, that no longer continues with that carrier. Verizon 1.16, T-Mobile 0.99, and AT&T 0.93 as of Q3 2024. You know, I started with T-Mobile in Q1 of 2016. I think T-Mobile was a little over 1.3% at that time. And not long before that, I think it was 2 and 3%. So it's come down significantly, and as this chart shows, it's pretty healthy. I mean, obviously nobody wants to have churn in their industry, but I mean, it's just a natural part of the industry, but it's a pretty healthy market among the big three. In Larry's opening remarks, he mentioned wireless competing with cable and broadband. This chart here shows fixed wireless access and how it's performed over the last few years in comparison to cable and broadband. So this shows net adds as of the last 12 months, and it's in thousands. So you can see pink or magenta, as Ian identified earlier, and also Verizon have grown significantly since 2022. Comcast, Charter, their net adds, they've dropped. It's almost like a mirror image of the increases and the decreases. Then you see AT&T coming to the game there in Q3 2023 as well. And as has been talked about, and as we talk about at this conference, technology changes on a regular basis. So as the technology changes, so do the forecasts. Historically or previously, the wireless carriers had estimated 23 million total fixed wireless access customers. At least that's what they thought they had the capacity for. And just in the last couple of months, T-Mobile increased their estimates, and I know some of the other carriers have as well. So we're currently sitting at 31 million for estimates, of which consumers are 19 million. And as of Q3 2024, T-Mobile there shows 12 million is their estimate. They're around 6 million. They say they, but I work for T-Mobile, so we. Verizon is about 4.2 of their 9.5, so 44%. AT&T was under 10% of their 7.2. They're sitting at around 500,000. And lastly, to Ruben's point, and also Ian was talking about this convergence. The top paragraph there has a couple of interesting things. It says AT&T mentioned convergence 26 times on its last 2 earnings calls. And Verizon validated the convergence theory with its recent purchase of Frontier. T-Mobile is less committed, but expects 12 to 15 million homes and has around 20 billion of merger and acquisition dry powder if necessary. So, and as the middle paragraph talks about there, it's kind of a race to the bottom. That's the concern, right? So, as convergence takes place and increased competition, prices are going to continue to decrease, and really is a race to the bottom. And you can think back to the calling card days, late 90s, early 2000s, and $1 a minute, 50 cents a minute, 25 cents a minute, 5 cents, and they're giving away calling cards. Is that going to happen with wireless and wireline eventually? I mean, it's going to be a ways away, but and at the bottom here, it talks about the players that are best positioned in the industry. So the top box there that are best positioned, at least according to this analyst, is AT&T, Comcast, and Charter, and they have some descriptions there as to why. But And then catching up is Verizon and Frontier with their recent purchase, and then T-Mobile they think is the most challenged, but it's held its own in the past, so we'll see what they pull out of their hat. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting talking about convergence and wireline going wireless and wireless going wireline. So
We got a question from Alfonso.
So like the joint venture with MetroNet is kind of the big one, but you're also kind of seeing a couple other off-balance sheet deals or kind of partnerships with other companies on the wireline side. So how much can you talk about that or any background?
You know, I haven't been given much information on that actually. So I know that there's stuff going on. What it is, I'm not really sure. So, I mean, we got out of the Sprint wireline. We sold that off for $1 and paid $600 million over several years. But so I don't know. I'm not sure if we're jumping back in or not. So
The only one I'm aware of is the Lumos joint venture that's going on, but that's not, total control. That's certainly I'm not even sure if that's minority or 50%.
Yeah, just for the record, though, all of those deals are still pending. So they have not closed and they are joint ventures and they will be deconsolidated. So they're not consolidated. So the JV will continue to report for property tax purposes, just like it always has. So it won't show up on T-Mobile's balance sheet.
If there's any that one, we'll transition
say that
over
again?
to the broadband network perspective with Gary Hunter.
So before I turn it over to John, I'll just briefly talk about kind of what's going on with subscribers on the broadband, and then I'll follow up with John on what's going on with AT&T. And then I think all of us will then try to talk about some of the valuation implications going on with that and take some questions. Brent kind of alluded to this, but when you look at broadband, we've got a market, when you look at 2024 of about 115 million subs out of a market of about 145 million, and you go out to 2030, it's really not growing much. So it's a pretty mature market. That's probably in large reasons it's either underserved or unserved areas is what's being captured. And you'll note that cable, while still has a pretty dominant share out there, that market share has been declining. Telcos have been relatively flat, and I'm going to touch upon that a little bit later because that's not just fiber in there. But what you do notice in there is fixed wireless is what's growing, and I think Brandt alluded to that. When you kind of pull the layers back, for telcos on fiber, that's where we're seeing a lot of growth on terms of net adds, and it's like kind of pointed out. Cable has seen some declines in terms of market share, but they still have the dominant share out there in the market out there. So with that, I'll turn it over to John.
So Charter wasn't part of the panel last year, so this is just kind of a recap of what's gone on in 23 and in 24. The big thing for us right now is, if you remember back 5 or 6 years ago, Charter was a big winner in the RDOF auction, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And from that, we've been expanding the network, and that's been like one of the main priorities of the business the last few years. So what that's added through year end 24, we've added 1.2 million passings, and that's translated into 400,000 subsidized rural passings. And looking at that, compared to the passings we had at year end 23, 7 million passings. So it's a small percentage. It's a little over 2% that's been added. And if you've seen our subscriber numbers over the past few years, even with those passings being added, we still have sub losses, video sub losses, internet sub losses, as everyone's mentioned already, and landline phone, VoIP. That business is basically almost gone away at this point. I mean, some still exist, but not as many. One thing with the RDOF, it was supposed to be fully done in 2028, but we're actually 2 years ahead of schedule with that. So that's to be completed now by year end 26. Initially, that started at the end of 2021. So then the other thing going on with the network is the evolution of the network. And a lot of this has been touched on already earlier in the presentations. But what we've done as Charter, we've completed phase 1, and this covered about 15% of our footprint. And that high split project with DOCSIS 3.1, got the ability, speeds up to 2 gigabit down, 1 gigabit up. And I think, if we think about TFI conferences in the past where the HFC network we felt was constrained and not going to be able to provide those kind of speeds, there have been developments that now allow those kind of speeds, and it's all happening not necessarily on the plant so much, but on the back end and the head ends with the equipment. And then changing out a lot of the amplifiers on the plant. And a lot of that has been going on at Charter the past 2 years. For the next 50%, we're actually using distributed access architecture. That's going to allow 5 gig down and 1 gigabit up. And then finally, the last piece for the other 35% is DOCSIS 4.0, and that's 10 gig down and 1 gig up. So with that, last September, I think it was, Charter and Comcast announced with Broadcom actually developing a chipset together. This isn't on here, but it's a 25 gig chip that would actually allow 25 down, I think 5 up, but that's obviously years and years until anything like that's going to be out. Finally, so after the network expansion and the network evolution, the programming, after hearing Alex's talk earlier, I don't even know if we need programming. Alex pretty much eliminated that. Everybody's going to be just looking at your smartphones, so nobody's going to be watching anything on TVs anymore. I guess the TV manufacturers can also kind of figure in 10 years or 8 years, they're going to cease to exist. A lot of this goes back to, if you remember, roughly fall 2023, with the ESPN, the Disney, and Spectrum agreement that went away. Everybody right at the beginning of college football and the NFL season lost their programming. And we had record calls into the call centers, right? Nobody wants to lose college football or NFL at the beginning of the season. So a few weeks later, Disney and Charter came to an agreement. And the big thing that came out of that is where before Disney would charge programming fees for their content to Charter customers who took the video product, but then separately sold that same streaming content to their customers. Well, if you're paying for it through Charter, you also now get through Charter that download or that streaming ability to their ESPN and their other products. We've taken that same model and applied it across all these different programmers that you see: ViX, Paramount Plus, Disney and ESPN, obviously Max. And so now, if you're a Charter video customer, which continue to decline annually, but you don't have to separately then pay for that through that direct programmer. You actually get that through your video subscription with Charter. There are some other ones that are coming in 2025 that I listed there. And it's just trying to make programming and viewing everything easier on the consumer. If you sign up for multiple streaming services, you know that switching between one or the other, finding where something's at, the box in the top left, it's the Xumo box that Charter and Comcast both have, similar to a Roku TV or Apple device. It's just the most recent device that Charter and Comcast both use. It's just making it easier for consumers to find the content that they want to watch. And through Cloud DVR, you can also store that electronically on the cloud and access it when you want. So that seamless entertainment, we're publicly saying that customers will receive up to $80 per month streaming apps at no extra cost. That's basically if you went individually and signed up for all those, that's what you would pay. So again, the one other thing I didn't mention here that Brandt mentioned on the one slide was about mobile. So for mobile, Charter at the end of last year, or 2024, 2023, I think we were approaching 8 million subs. And so we're getting close to the 10 million sub number for mobile. But it is the one thing that does make customers less likely to switch. The mobile offering I think it's $29.99 per month, is lower than what you can get directly from a mobile provider if you subscribe to the internet service. So it's that. If you think of the old bundle back in the day, it was really video, internet, and landline phone. That landline phone's been replaced with mobile.
Which is why it showed that Frontier, Charter, and AT&T are probably best positioned because Charter and Frontier can just do MVNOs with cell coverage, and they already have the fiber and the wireline industries.
So for those who are interested in learning a little bit about our strategy, AT&T had what they called the Analyst and Industry Days at the first part of December. And a lot of what we're doing on the network around convergence, and I'll touch upon some of these things. But one of the things they did talk about on convergence is when you have a combination of a fiber and a wireless subscribers, the subscription increase is about 400 basis points. So customers do look for that same, they want to deal with simplicity. And if you have the same customers, sort of what John and Brandt were talking about, it's certainly that it appears to be where the market is going. Larry touched upon fiber. Fiber, from our view, is a superior product. I don't know, Larry, I mean, it's going to be around for a long time. It's unlimited right now in terms of capabilities. It's more of a function of electronics, and you know, we're going to 10 gigs, it'll be 100 gigs and so forth. And it's a very good product from a performance perspective. As pointed out at the industry days, you know, fiber is a passive, it's just the fiber passive network, doesn't use electricity. It's real easy to maintain. You have fewer electronics in there. They had said that the maintenance costs on that to operate is 35% cheaper than what we have on our legacy copper network. And I'll get into a little bit later on the marks on that. Certainly higher functionality and long terms, certainly lower CapEx. So from our perspective, it's got a lot of advantages. And when you look at this and you look at the fibers growing, the industry as a whole is about 65 million homes have passed with fiber. And by 2030, we're looking at about 100 million. And you're looking at the penetration rates going from around 34% to about 65% of the homes by 2030. And you may look at this chart and you look at the original chart I showed at the beginning about the broadbands and telcos being flat. The reason is this fiber is replacing copper. And so when you look at broadband subscribers in that original chart, it's capturing all broadband subscribers, DSL, fiber, and so forth. And so we're just swapping customers for the most part. I mean, there's some growth on it. But in large part, that's what we're looking at. And I'll get into a little bit of the regulatory reasons for that. In terms of number of passings and subscribers, AT&T, according to Oppenheimer, had 28. We're actually 29 million. We've actually doubled the number of fiber subscribers since 2020. By 29, we're expected to pass 50 million. 45 million of that will be our own network subscribers. And then we have a joint venture with Gigapower. That coupled with some other access providers will give us another 5 million by 2029. So 30 million total homes passed by 2029. When we look at the build out, and I'll touch a little bit on some of the valuation implications on this, but most of our fiber build, 85% of it, they're close to it, and that's for the industry, is an overbuild. What do I mean by overbuild? We have our copper network, legacy copper network out there, and we can't shut it down until all the customers have been migrated off that. And so we've got fiber running along it. And so we're operating two networks until we can get that done. Until we have no subscribers, or in some areas where there's zero demand, then we can get relief from the FCC to shut down that network. Until then, we're operating that network. If you go to what we said at the Industry and Analyst Day back in December, that legacy cost right now is $6 billion a year of additional costs on AT&T right now that we're incurring to operate that network. And you may look back and say, well, what regulatory requirements? Last year, We don't have COLA relief, which is carrier last resort relief in California. And these are just a couple of the headlines. We tried to get relief in California last year. We were excruciated in the press. And the California Public Utility Commission eventually rejected our request to withdraw from carrier last resort provisions in California. It's a real thing. It's costing a lot of money. And it's a challenge that we have to face, and we're trying to work through. But until we can get that done, it's still going to be a burden on our network. With that.
Yeah, so you bring up the tax valuation implications. So as you saw in my slides, where we're expanding the network, and in the past, when you used to expand the network, you'd also see sub increases that would come off of that, video sub increases, internet sub increases. But now the internet subs and the video subs continue to decline, yet we're adding more passings. So on those new passings, because you're doing it in the non-dense areas. If you remember from TFI's past, or if any of you go to Wichita, Jim from CostQuest presents on the broadband map, the entire map, and how all the dense areas have been taken. And now what is left is this area of the country that doesn't have the wireline broadband. Now with fixed wireless access, they can subscribe that way. So if they don't have a good choice for a high-speed product, they're going to probably take the first one that comes in, and then after that, they're going to start looking at price. So our initial passings are with the RDOF are going into those areas, but then it's going to be a price issue between the T-Mobiles, the Verizons, AT&T, and an offering of a fixed wireless product. So we're going in with a high cost network, and then getting returns on that network are difficult. So from a valuation standpoint, what is somebody going to pay for that network once it's constructed if there are very little returns? Probably not much. Probably not what it costs to build it.
And then with AT&T, it's sort of a kind of tale of two tales. So part of our network, about half of our geographic footprint, is what we call our fiber first network. It's the more heavily dense part of the network, more subscribers. It's cost effective for us to build out our network there. About 50% of our network is what we call wireless first sites. Those networks, again, make up about half of our geographic footprint. We have 4 subscribers per square mile in that area. And kind of put that in perspective, if we can charge $70 per subscriber per month for that, and assume a 50% EBITDA margin, which is pretty generous, and assume 100% take rate, the annual revenue or annual profit on that is about $1,500 after tax. It'll cost us somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 to deploy fiber in that same area. You're not going to make the money. And so for those areas, and because of some of the technology progressions that on the wireless side and so forth, we can provide alternative technologies on the fiber side, whether it's fixed wireless and so forth, that provide greater functionality in those areas. But it's not going to make sense to deploy, at least without some sort of subsidy from the federal government, to deploy fiber in those areas.
Yeah, either from the federal, or we also have some state grants too that have helped with some of the build out. Thinking back though to Ruben's presentation on the data centers and the server type of equipment, so about that network evolution, where we're going in and ripping out all the old equipment that was in there and replacing it with new equipment that can provide those higher speeds, and seeing what you had there as the useful life, right, 3 to 5 years, and seeing how typically with taxing jurisdictions, this is one of the issues that we constantly bring up, is that these are really computer-like, very computer-like. They are computers, and they shouldn't be on an 8 to 10 year life table. They should be on a 3 to 5 year life table. It's going to be just educating people about that and getting that information out, because as we keep replacing that equipment, as each new generation comes along, if we don't do that, and we sit at a higher percent good on that, it's just definitely overpaying tax on that equipment.
It's, I think innately, we're all visual people, as valuation experts and identifying the difference in what, a piece of equipment looks like 15 years ago versus what it looks like today. That can go a long way. I mean, if you're describing something that historically looked like it fit into a central office, or at some type of small shed inside of underneath the base of a tower. If you look at it now, it just looks like a server box, and that server box looks like any other server box that any other major tech carrier carries. And if they're putting it on a 3 to 5 year life, AT&T and Charters of the world are not going to be using it for 10 years. That's the fact of the technology shift, is that those pieces of equipment are going to need to be upgraded at that same cycle. They're not using it for a long period of time. It's the same stuff. So I think we've reached a good spot where we can start opening this up to some Q&A. Maybe we'll start with Don over here.
Try to use the mics when we can. Just a second.
Gary, I like your story about your carrier of last resort, and you answered part of my question already about that. Rural areas in California is where you have a lot of your last resorts, and I know that there's been some other competitors stepping in with grant funds and putting fiber into those areas. How far do you think you're going to be able to go? I don't know if you have an example describing just how far you're able to go, meaning that at what level do you stop? I mean, I understand you're looking at EBITDA, and you talked a little bit about that. At what level do you stop and say you can't go any further and you can't do more?
Yeah, so, I mean, one, we have an obligation to serve all the customers, right? And so one of the things that happened late last year, we got approval from the FCC on what we call the AT&T Phone Advance product, which will provide the same sort of service that you get today on the copper network for carrier last resort. You can do that over the wireless network, and the FCC did approve that. And so that's something that we're going to try to introduce in those areas. I mean, we've said that we don't plan on shutting down any of those areas, until we have something that can replace it. But we can't begin doing that process until we get relief from carrier last resort out there, Don.
So if you do that, would that be connected to your own network, or could you connect that to, let's say, a wireless network that might be in that area?
Yeah, I think it's just our network.
Okay.
That's a good question. But I do know that we said we would deploy fiber in those areas. For those areas that we don't have a solution, we don't plan on just going out and taking or retiring that copper and leaving people without some sort of solution as an alternative. So.
Yeah, no, I didn't think you were. I knew that was the case, but I was just sometimes cost effective. You listed two ways of doing it: putting fiber or not doing anything. I mean,
well, we're putting fiber in. We are applying for BEAD money in areas. Every state operates that a little bit differently, to the extent we can get it. And then what I said, we also have a strategy for what we call wireless first areas, where, I mean, it's just, at the end of the day, we got to be able to invest in areas and get some sort of reasonable rate of return on it. So.
Maybe it'd be a good opportunity to talk about if you guys have a good sense for your BEAD strategy overall as a company. Not to put you on the spot, I know Jim is going to talk about some of the intricacies behind the BEAD funding. BEAD, for those of you who aren't aware, it's a $45 billion subsidy program that was created by the federal government to help subsidize build for unserved and underserved customers across the United States. And we are talking primarily very, very rural areas where it'll cost $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $10,000 per customer passed. In some of those instances, fiber might be the best possibility, but we've also heard some discussions about whether or not alternative technologies are going to be allowed. But if you guys have any sense of where the BEAD is and where you think it's going to go for your company, that'd be helpful.
I think for Charter, right now, what's been publicly said and is right now we're not interested in BEAD at the moment, as far as I'm aware. But, you know, we did do RDOF, and now we see the economics of what happened with doing that. So I think that could be a reason why they're publicly saying that they're not interested in BEAD at the moment. But again, it's too soon to tell for us.
Karen, you can go ahead and start talking. You're on.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Well, this comment doesn't really fit since they had kind of moved on to BEAD, but for charter and light companies, John had mentioned that they have some upcoming new offerings for 2025 for programming. And I was just thinking, since we all heard, what Alex had to say earlier, with new offerings, maybe gearing more towards your older adults for programming might help with subscriptions. And then as far as the younger, trying to engage the younger adults, I don't know what's going on with video games these days. Maybe finding a way to incorporate video games. I haven't heard anybody since the emergence of social media. You don't hear about the popular video games as much as you used to. So I don't know if those are avenues that companies can explore.
Well, yeah, I don't think we've heard about any particular company strategies when it comes to video games. I know that there's not a lot of overlap with ownership of video game studios or even video game providers like Xbox being Microsoft or Sony with the PlayStation. If there is, I would presumably they would have gone into the market and identified some sort of program where they could offer at a discount, much like what Spectrum is doing right now with some kind of discount where that you don't have to sign up with Xbox and pay, the $6 and $7 a month, that you could get it for free by virtue of being a broadband customer. I haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen any company entertain that. That sounds like a good idea, to be honest, and maybe you should reach out and talk to some of those folks about that. I would definitely think that's pretty sound as far as the strategy goes.
Yeah, Alfonso.
Yeah, and John, so I think for you guys, you got hit pretty hard with ACP, but can you go into a little bit what ACP is and kind of how it affected your subscriber counts?
Sorry, what was that?
Affordable connectivity program.
Yeah, with the connectivity program that expired a ways back now, a few quarters back. Yeah, we've seen a decrease based on that in broadband subs, but I guess not as bad as the market thought it would have been. We're still able to retain some of those subs, and some of that was by bundling that mobile line with that internet product. That was one way to keep them, and then we have to wait and see if they still keep that when that program rolls off. But yeah, that was as far as the connectivity program that was came out of COVID.
There we go. I have a question for my cable friends, and I'm going to rope you into Christian, even though you're not on the panel. But it's a lighthearted question to go into it, and I guess for me, I'm a huge CNBC fan, right? And I saw the recent announcement that Comcast is spinning off a lot of its networks, CNBC included. And when I saw the bundle of what was included, it really crushed me, because I'm a huge fan of CNBC and I follow the markets, and it's like, well, you want to get rid of those, but my wife is a huge Bravo fan, and you refuse to sell Bravo as part of that bundle. I wonder if you can give any insights into that. I mean, I'm worthless, and she is the valuable part of this relationship, so.
Absolutely. Pretty accurate. And what's your question?
No.
But in all honesty, it's the streaming eyeballs. Bravo drives a ton of streaming views. Bravo content drives a ton of streaming views on Peacock and other platforms. All the rest of the networks that are being spun off, a lot less so. And I think that's the bottom line here.
Got it. And it was Bravo and Telemundo you were keeping, I think, were the two that you were keeping, and the rest were getting spun out. But Bravo is a big eyeball one. On a more serious note, leading into that, I mean, you're getting rid of the networks, you're figuring out how to streamline or structure things differently. I joked about you last night, you know, you and I were chatting. It was just like, Comcast was recently on CNBC, one of the analysts that says, Comcast is the GE of the current decade, right? And to me, that was a kiss of death, right? Because GE struggled for 10 years as being this conglomerate and in the value of the pieces versus the whole. So I wanted to tee that up with you. And then John also on Charter, right? Liberty and the complex legal structure around all the different entities. It looks like the Liberty piece was being consolidated, I think, right, into Charter, if that's what I'm understanding. Malone is...
So yeah, that'll be a multi-year process. That announcement came out there in the fall, winter of Q4. But Steve, on a serious note, we're going to really miss your lighthearted questions, and we feel for your wife, who's a saint, if she's actually going to be spending more time with you now that you're going to be retired yourself.
Below deck, baby. But on the tea leaf side of it, is that more things to come in the future? That do I read into that correctly? That I'm streamlining my structure so I have more flexibility and functionality to deal with potential M&A?
I mean, TBD, obviously. I think what we've all heard publicly is obviously really the limit of what I can comment on. I think analysts have speculated for a while that Comcast and others in the industry have been kind of weighed down by the combination of all the different business units, and you know, a spinoff could make sense as far as the financial markets would see it. However, I'm not sure that management feels the same way, and you know, I think a lot of us are a lot more confident in our leadership than perhaps others like GE were in the past. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and on the Charter side, as far as programming goes, we don't have anything to the extent that Comcast has. So, you know, other than some regional RSNs and some news, we don't have the programming. We're trying to deliver that value to the customer by taking that Disney model and using it on the other programmers, so that our customers, video customers, are not paying double because they subscribe to an app or a streaming service and also to us for video.
Going back a little bit to BEAD funding, I know Gary addressed it a little bit in his direct presentation, and John mentioned his point on Ruben's question. T-Mobile, so it remains to be seen, I guess, what T-Mobile does in other states, but at least what's been publicly stated, and not to steal too much what Jim's going to talk about, but T-Mobile did participate in Louisiana, and they teamed up with some other companies and did receive funding there in Louisiana for BEAD funding.
Yeah, and I think Jim will touch upon it, but I think also there's some, you know, the new administration, and we got to figure out what's going to happen there. I mean, in large part, you know, when we look at the BEAD programs and we looked at stuff in Louisiana, we're going to look at it, try to participate, but at the end of the day, it still needs to make economic sense. So.
We're at 3:30, unless there's any other questions. Are we set to go until 3:30?
Until 3:45.
Okay.
We can take as long as you want for questions.
Well, I mean, it was my understanding, hey, Steve, it's my understanding from Christian and John that there's a clause in the SEC filings that they need to consult with you first, so.
There's somebody on
Actually, the other 15 minutes were supposed to be taken up by Jeff and his trivia. So that's really where the other time was, and since Jeff wasn't able to make it, that was the other 15
We have a
minutes.
question here from Augie.
All right, I'm going to throw a curve at you. Nobody here has mentioned anything about the satellite competition that either Starlink working with your systems or Starlink working against your system to provide fixed broadband. Any thoughts, projection, and not just Starlink, but obviously Amazon is trying to play the same game. Any thoughts about how they figure into the universe that you're populating?
You know, before these guys get a chance to answer, this is, I mean, it's telling because we did do a feature presentation on this last year. Brought in gentlemen to discuss the LEO outlook and this current strategies. And, you know, I think the sense back then was that it's a very small niche market. And, you know, it'd probably be a good time to discuss if anything has changed on that front, if anything, you know, more revelatory has been discovered about the potential to serve these customers. Anyone?
Yeah, obviously, another competitor that was seen in the past, but appears to be more of a bigger player now, with more satellites being launched every day, it seems like. But Brandt, do you guys have some sort of relationship with Starlink, with T-Mobile?
We do, yeah. I don't know much of the details, and if I did, I probably wouldn't be at liberty to say it, but yes, there is, T-Mobile has teamed up with Starlink.
I just wanted to add that Comcast does have a strategic partnership with Starlink as well, currently limited to business services customers to serve underserved, unserved areas, multi-location businesses over a wide geographic region. But I'm sure there could be an opportunity to expand the relationship in the future.
Got a question from Jim. Jim Stegman at CostQuest. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Ruben from Kroll. Just in regard to Starlink, so for BEAD purposes, Starlink was precluded from participating in the first kind of go-around of BEAD because BEAD was focused on fiber deployment. Expectation is that may change. Not sure why. You could all kind of read the tea leaves, but there is intense pressure from the new administration to change BEAD. There has been rumors that Starlink has been in and said, give us all the BEAD money and we can do it for $10 billion. So I know Starlink is putting a lot of pressure on the administration to adjust the BEAD rules for those states that haven't kicked off their program yet. So.
And Jim, what is the percent that does not have broadband access right now?
I think in the last release of the FCC, it's 6% are unserved, so under 25.3, and I think 1.5% are underserved, so it's about anywhere from about 6 to 8%.
I'll just add one thing on our wireless network. For those who don't know, we had.
Sorry, guys. That was my fault.
So historically, AT&T's cell sites were either built by Ericsson or Nokia. Nokia was around 40% of the market out there. We made an announcement at the end of 2023 that we're going to 100% Ericsson. And we talked about it at the Analyst Day, but we're going to go in and go to more of an O-RAN market. We're going to be modernizing and touching all 77,000 cell sites to replace a lot of the equipment on those sites over the next 3 years. There's a lot of cost efficiency, some of the issues that Ian talked about in terms of the spectrum constraints out there and the need to have more efficient equipment and those things. That's playing part into it, but quite a bit of effort that's going to go into our networks over the next 3 years. So.
I had a quick question for John. When Charter did the RDOF expansion, what was the technology? Was it HFC or was it fiber or what?
So it was both HFC and fiber, depending on where it was. What we found, though, if you remember, Jim will certainly remember the issues we had with the poles that were in those rural areas. So what we found, and the permitting regarding the poles. So what ended up happening, and it wasn't part of the plan to begin with, but a lot of that ended up being buried. And it did turn into be a lot of fiber. So potentially you have a dense market who's had a historic HFC network, and the service there at that time wouldn't have been as good as potentially a rural passing that would have been all fiber. So a fiber, because, like you were saying, 4 homes passed per mile, or, something less than 25 probably. they could be getting great service, and somebody in the middle of a city who had an old historic connection, just not as good. So it did end up being a lot of fiber. I mean, if you're going into a greenfield now, why not put the fiber in now? There's no reason to put a HFC network in.